So the topic today, the topic you'll have seen in the email is "You Know It As You Know Your Own Sons," the Quran's challenge over the familiarity of its revelation to the people of the book in Surah 2, Ayah 146, Surah 6, Ayah 20, and Surah 74, 31. There's a lot I'm going to try and cover in this. I basically try to cram in all the key points of my thesis. Obviously, I can't go into that detail. You'll be glad to know. But hopefully, if it's of interest, you can email me and I'd be very happy to send you a copy and discuss it further. So as I said, this is based on my MPhil thesis. The title there I thought was quite snappy, even if a bit less clear. It was called The Quranic Paternity Test, attempting to recognize our own sons, and then the same verse numbers. And it'll become clearer later on what that title is referring to. It was a 25,000 word thesis. I've been improving it since then. I've hopefully been improving it since then. It's now about 40,000 words. And this was part of my latest MPhil, which was the MPhil in Islamic Studies and History. So thank you all so much for coming. Presumably you're here because something caught your interest in the title. And hopefully this talk will appeal to a number of people. So we're going to be covering topics. The big overriding topic that I'm very interested in is how the Quran relates to the Bible. To look at that, we're obviously going to be focusing in on the text of the Quran. We're going to have a bit of tafsir as well, which is the Islamic commentaries on the Quran. And then also there's a little bit of this talk will tie into the topic of early Islamic origins. I won't go into this much. It's very controversial. And let me reassure you, I don't actually normally go in for controversial ideas. But the way in which I ended up reading the Quranic text actually could fit in with some of the historical theories about a more northern geographic origin of the Quran. I won't go into that a lot, but I'll be happy to discuss that in the Q&A. So what are the verses in question? So the Quranic paternity test was the original title, and that's because of this unique phrase that I just stumbled upon while I was reading the Quran. And you get this same exact phrase in two, but only two, places in the Quran, and that's 2146 and 620, and I will read it as follows. Those who gave scripture know it or know him, the Arabic suffix there is who, as well as they know their own sons, but some of them hide the truth that they know. And then in 620, those to whom we have given the scripture know this or it or him, as well as they know their own sons. Those who have lost their souls will not believe. And we'll get more into what those verses in their context are referring to. Third verse is quite different, and so it doesn't quite fall under the same rubric. It doesn't use this particular phrase, but I included it in my thesis because I thought it touched upon some similar themes, and I'll explain that as I go on. So the third section, the third verses, are in Surah 74, ayahs 30 to 31. The preceding verses have all been describing hellfire. It's a warning, and we pick up on verse 30. There are 19 in charge of it, that is, in charge of hell. And then in verse 31, we get an expanded commentary on what this means. These are none other than angels appointed by us to guard hellfire. And we have made their number a test for the disbelievers. So those who have been given the scripture will be certain, and those who believe will have their faith increased. Neither those who have been given the scripture nor the disbelievers will have any doubts. But the sick at heart and the disbelievers will say, what could God mean by this description? God leaves whoever he will to stray and guides whoever he will. No one knows your Lord's forces except him. This is a warning to mortals. Just to give you a sense of where I'll be going. So the first two verses stress on a particular topic, they stress the clarity with which the Quran and the Bible are supposed to agree or are supposed to overlap. Whatever is being referred to, this is something that the people who are given the book are supposed to recognize as clearly as they recognize their own sons. To preempt what I will say later, my understanding of this verse, and that seemingly of the earliest Mufassirun, the earliest commentators on this verse, is that the number 19 for the angels of hell is something that the people who were given the scripture will recognize from the Torah and from the gospel. And so this introduces another element, which is the specificity with which the Quran and the Bible are supposed to agree on certain topics. I'll pick up more on that later. So as I said, I'm very interested in the broad topic, as are many Christians involved in Christian-Muslim dialogue, of what does the Quran say about the Bible? How does it relate to the Bible? And it is very common for Christians to say that the Quran actually has a very positive view of the Bible and affirms the reliability of the Bible. There are certain verses they often appeal to, and this will include practicing Christians. This will also include possibly Christian, but kind of Western scholars commenting on the Bible. So here are some of the verses that have been appealed to. So in 547, let the followers of the gospel judge according to what God has sent down in it. Well, how can they do that unless they still have the gospel? In Surah 3:3-4, it talks about the Quran being sent down, confirming what went before. Musaddiqan, confirming. There's no kind of hint here that the former scriptures have been textually corrupted. And then finally, in 1094, the Prophet himself is told, if you are in doubt about what we have revealed to you, ask those who've been reading the scriptures before you. This suggests that those scriptures have some kind of truth value within them. So it's very common for Christians to point these verses, which often prompts a few very common responses from Muslim dialogue partners. So I've labelled what I think are the three most popular responses. Response A is that the original Torah and Gospel were preserved, but that this actually was lost before the time of Muhammad. I think, and many think, this doesn't make good sense of those passages that talk about the Quran confirming and speaking well of the scriptures which are with you, ma'akum, seemingly in the present tense, or the fact that Muhammad is still in the present tense to be found in the Torah and in the Gospel. Another option is to say that the Torah, the true Torah and the true Gospel did exist at the time of Muhammad, but that these are in fact different from the Torah and the Gospel that we know of today. This is theologically perhaps easier, exegetically easier. Historically, it's quite difficult to match this up with the manuscript evidence that we have, because we have the entirety of the New Testament, the four Gospels, and the Torah from centuries before the revelation of the Quran. Perhaps what I would call the most sophisticated response is to say, well, the Quran is to a large extent confirming the Torah and the Gospel, but only when it's kind of filtered through a Quranic lens. And this is quite popular, I would say, to those who often interact with Christians and with the actual text of the Old and the New Testament, of the Torah and of the Gospel in particular. So Muhammad Asad, when he's commenting on the Arabic word Muhaymin in Surah 548, he translates this as confirming the truth of whatever there still remains. Sorry, the Quran is the Muhaymin, and it is confirming the truth of whatever there still remains of earlier revelations and determining what is true thereon. It's kind of an authenticating filter. Muhammad Abu Layla, when he's commenting on, approvingly, the famous Ibn Hazm, he talks about how his understanding was that the criterion on which his distinctions are made is the Quran itself. He accepts what is consistent with the Quran and rejects what is incompatible with it. And then I've listed a couple of other contemporary Muslims who take a similar approach. A sophisticated version of this that I've seen is that from Shabir Ali, who's a very well-known Muslim speaker, and he has debated with many Christians. And I think he's worth quoting, and I will move on from this in a moment, but I'm just trying to paint the background. And I think it's worth quoting in full. I move on now to an interesting, and this was a debate, a discussion on the topic of how does the Quran view the Christian scriptures. I move on now to an interesting book, which I believe to be a game changer in Islamic studies. For a long time, many academic scholars had said very much what David in the debate, and also what I would say, and what Abdullah Saeed has been persuaded. And for a time, I myself was being inclined to that position as well, to think that it looks like the Quran is actually affirming the Torah and the Gospel as it existed at the time when the Quran was being revealed in all its totality. However, this book by Sidney Griffith, called The Bible in Arabic, says two things. One is that the Bible, according to the Quran, has been changed. And two, according to the Quran again, that the Quran's view is that the Quran is restoring the original Bible stories. The Quran is telling us the way it should be understood. And I won't read this out in full, you can glance through it. He's commenting here specifically on Surah 7:157, where it says the people of the book will find Muhammad written or described with them in the Torah and in the Gospel. And what Shabir Ali stresses here is it's saying whom they will find. And what that means is Jews and Christians, if they use, Christians, if they use the same methods they used to find Jesus in the Old Testament, whether that be midrash, typology, pesha, etc., these kind of slightly looser exegetical methods. If one applies that, then one can find Muhammad in the Bible. So this kind of prompted me to actually go and read Sidney Griffith myself, and it's a very interesting work. I do recommend it highly. And here's a key quotation from him. "The gospel that the Quran confirms is not the gospel as Christians recognized it in the Quran's own day. Rather, following the model of its own distinctive prophetology, the Quran speaks of the gospel as a scripture God gave to Jesus." And then it quotes Surah 5:46, "We gave him the gospel, wherein is guidance and light, confirming what he had before him of the Torah." The him there is Jesus. So, and Sidney Griffith doesn't answer this question exactly, the question of, so in Surah 5:47, what are Christians meant to judge by when they're told to judge by the gospel? But the best answer I can imagine from what he's saying is, like Shabir Ali, that Christians have to be aware that their scriptures are corrupted and read them in light of the Quran. And Sidney Griffith talks about how the Quran's recollections of the biblical patriarchs and prophets, according to the paradigm of its own prophetology, bespeaks the Arabic scriptures' correct, even polemical stance towards Jewish and Christian scriptures and traditional law. And this is really what inspired my thesis, was reading these words by Sidney Griffith. I was trying to think, well, does the Quran's prophetology necessarily, the fact that the Quran has a different prophetology, a different understanding of the prophets and biblical history, does that mean the Quran is intentionally correcting those accounts? And that's something that I challenge. Before I get back to the verses which I've mentioned, I do go into my thesis to try and answer Griffith's charge here. Does the Quran's altered prophetology imply it is acting as a textual corrective? I can't go into these in detail, but I provide a few possible responses. I talk about it's generally thought by Quranic scholars that if the Quran is indeed engaging with pre-existing Jewish and Christian stories, it's not by dealing with written texts before it, but in an oral milieu, where these stories are known, they're told in the synagogues, they're passed on in the marketplace, and so on. And so what we often find actually in the Quran are allegations of concealing and textual and oral corruption, the mispronouncing of the texts and the misrepresenting of them. And so when the Quran changes these stories, it may be assuming that actually where it deviates from the canonical Torah and the canonical Gospels, it is the oral corruption that has misrepresented those otherwise textually pure scriptures. Another possibility is that where the Quran mildly deviates from the Torah and the Gospel, this could be due to the oral milieu. As Sidney Griffith himself says, the Quran is not trying to completely retell these stories, it's kind of referring back to them and recalling them. And so minor variations in detail may not matter as much in an oral milieu. And then finally, I do talk in my thesis what many others, previous prophets in the Quran, seems to be somewhat modelled by and shaped by the prophet's own experience in the 7th century. I call this the prophetic assumption, where the Quran postulates things that don't quite match up in the Torah and the Gospel. This may not be the Quran insisting that those scriptures are corrupt. It's therefore be in those former scriptures, whether or not their custodians, the Jews and the Christians, accurately convey that. So that's the big picture. I think this is an interesting topic, and these verses I've come across suggest, no, the Quran is not trying to criticize the text of these scriptures. The Quran speaks very highly of them, and not just in broad outline, within which there might be some discrepancy, and not just by kind of reading between the lines in the Torah and the Gospel. No, these verses I've come across suggest the clarity and the specificity with which there is supposed to be harmony between the Quran and the former scriptures. So let's dive into the meat of these passages. So just to remind you, these were the passages from Surah 2:146 and Surah 6:20. So what do these passages mean? The interpretation that I go for, so let's start with Surah 2, ayah 146. The interpretation that I go for, and seemingly the earliest position that we can find in the Muslim commentaries, at least that I have found, is that it is saying the people of the scripture recognize this as clearly as they recognize their own sons, in the context, that is talking about the fact that the direction of prayer should be towards the Islamic holy site. So Surah 2 verses 142 up to 152, they're all kind of on this similar topic. I'll pick up at verse 145. It might get a bit repetitive, but that's on purpose. I want you to see how the overwhelming context of this passage is about the direction of prayer. Yet even if you brought every proof to those who were given the scripture, they would not follow your prayer direction, nor will you follow theirs, nor indeed will any of them follow one another's direction. If you were to follow their desires after the knowledge brought to you, you would be doing wrong. And now our key verse. Those we gave scripture know it as well as they know their own sons, but some of them hide the truth that they know. The truth is from your Lord, so do not be one of those who doubt. And again, we pick up on the direction of prayer. Each community has its own direction to which it turns, race to do good deeds, and wherever you are, God will bring you together. In fact, to save time, I won't read the rest of it, but if you've glanced down, the entirety of this section is all about the direction of prayer. And it's not just these verses, 142 to 152. Indeed, actually, the topic of sacred areas and sacred and direction is something that crops up time and again in Surah Al-Baqarah, in Surah 2. So as far back as verse 115, it talks about the east and the west belong to God. Wherever you turn, there is his face. God is all-pervading and all-knowing. In verses 125 to 129, we have a narrative whereby it talks about how Abraham and his son Ishmael built up the foundations of the house. So the sanctuary area has Abrahamic origins. In 158, so this is after our passage, again, we have kind of sacred holy areas. It's talking about Safa and Marwa being among the rights of God and about pilgrimage in this area. I can't go into it in detail. I actually think this is also something the people of the book are supposed to recognize because of the following verses. As for those who hide the proofs and guidance we sent down, after we have made them clear to people in the scripture, God rejects them. The reason I think that might be referring to the people of the book is that that word to conceal, katama, is very often applied to the people of the scripture in the Quran. And then finally, in verse 177, kind of picking up again on verse 115, we again have a direction of prayer. Goodness does not consist in turning your face towards east or west. So how did the earliest Muslims understand this? Well, just to go to one English reference early on to make it easy. So in the study Quran, it notes that some commentators understand that what they recognize as they recognize their children is the fact that the Kaaba is the true Qibla. And it cites Tabari there, who we'll get onto in a moment. And it also notes that this is evidently following the similar message a couple of verses earlier in 144, where they are said to know that this is the truth. So Muqatil ibn Sulaiman is often appealed to by scholars because he's to my knowledge, he's the earliest complete commentary on the Quran that we have. He dies in 150 AH 767 CE. And commenting on this verse, he quotes the Prophet, "Indeed you, that is the Jews, know that circumambulation of the house is the truth, and it is the Qibla written in the Torah and the Gospel, but you conceal what is in the book of God of the truth and you deny it." And then when he comments specifically on our key word, yahrifunahu, they recognize it, he states very tersely, that is, they recognize al-Bayt al-Haram, that is the Qibla. Tafsir at-Tabari, who is a very renowned commentator, and he's very useful. He passes on a lot of earlier positions and labels them clearly, so he's very helpful. He's writing in the early 10th century of the Common Era, and he introduces his comments on this verse thus. So these are his introductory comments. He says, "Those great ones of the Jews and the scholars of the Christians recognize that al-Bayt al-Haram, that is the sacred house, is their Qibla, and the Qibla of Abraham and the Qibla of the prophets before thee, as they recognize their sons." And then he lists a number of opinions from individuals. I won't go through them all, you can have a glance down. And when he's commenting on this section, they recognize it. Every single one of them thinks that the direction of prayer, the holy sanctuary, this is the issue at hand. Now, commenting on the latter part of verse 146, where it's discussing they conceal the truth, he does have a few commentators there who bring Muhammad into the discussion. about them recognizing Muhammad, and we're going to discuss that later. But the overwhelming opinions given, but all his arrangements. But I can translate and recognize one of the opinions is as follows. The book recognize the matter as they recognize their sons. And it is the opinion of these authorities, whom I believe we've already come across in Tabari. And then just to give you a sense of modern Muslim interpretation, here's a modern Muslim translation. It's actually a very conservative, I think Salafi one, the Hilali Khan translation. And it's interesting, it says, those to whom we gave the scripture recognize him, and then it both lists recognizing Muhammad and recognizing the Kaaba at Mecca as they recognize their son. So this aspect of this verse has indeed endured up until the is not particularly mentioned in the Bible. Arabia is mentioned to some extent, not a huge amount. And it made me think of the Petra hypothesis, or those scholars who have proposed a more northern geographic milieu. And I realized that it's much easier to read. We've already seen how the Quran associates Abraham and Ishmael with this direction of prayer. They're mentioned quite closely together. And so if you read the Genesis accounts, which talk about Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael, the geographical place names that are mentioned, particularly Kadesh Barnea, but others as well, are much closer to Petra. And indeed, Kadesh Barnea is understood by this idea of a more northern geographic milieu of the Quran has been hypothesized, speculated by a number of scholars. I think as far back as kind of Wansborough hints at it, Gerald Horting, Cronin Cook. These are kind of Wansborough students in a sense, at least ideologically. Nevo and Coran, these are generally quite radical scholars, but I think on this one point, actually, this does fit nicely with my reading of the Quranic text, and I'm happy to discuss this more later. But another, this verse is talking about recognizing the prophet Muhammad. And indeed, one can plausibly read that text in this way. So if we dive into the immediate context of the verse, let's pick up at verse 145. It would, but then you can see a shift here. If you, prophet, were to follow their desires after the knowledge brought to you, al-ilm, brought to you, you would be doing wrong. So perhaps there is a subtle shift now to the issue of revelation and the prophet Muhammad. So you could say, those we gave scripture know him, Muhammad, as well as they know their own sons, but some of them hide the truth that they know. The truth is from your Lord, so we're still talking about revelation. So due to the broader context of the direction of prayer. Now, this does make good canonical sense. There are indeed other places in the can be found 7 and then you perhaps get a little description there of what that prophecy might be. And then in 61:6, although it doesn't say this is in the gospel, we have this narrative from Jesus. where he is said to confirm the Torah, whose name will be Ahmad. And Ahmad linguistically is quite similar to Muhammad. It's the same root. Also, we are, and you'll be glad to know I spend most of my time on 2146. We will be quicker with the other verses because they interrelate. An advantage of understanding the Prophet Muhammad to be in view is that this means we can understand 2146 and 620 reference. They are both referring to Muhammad. If you don't go down that route, you do have to postulate, as I do, that the same phrase is being used for actually quite different topics, and we'll discuss what those are. So in 6:19 to 21, say what counts most as a witness. Say God is witness between you and me. This Quran was revealed for me to warn you and everyone it reaches. Do you really bear? So this Quran was revealed to me. We've got the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad. Do you really bear witness that there are other gods beside God? Say, I myself do not bear witness. Say he is only one God, and I disown whatever you join with him. Those to whom we give the scripture know him, Muhammad, as well as they know their own sons. Those will believe. Who's to someone against God or in his revelation? So you can see in front of him specifically for the words Yahrifunahu, they recognize him, but in the latter part about concealing the truth. So Abu Ja'far thinks that both the Qibla and Muhammad are in view here, and then Mujahid and Qatada think that Muhammad is the object of concealing. Later on, again, the classical commentator Fakhruddin Razi, one of the opinions he lists is quite clear that God Most Exalted did not mention in the Quran the matter of the transfer of the Qibla being in the Torah and the Gospel, but instead that the prophethood of Muhammad was mentioned in the Torah and the Gospel. And then Al-Qurtubi, another esteemed commentator, he says the third person pronoun it, referring back to the book, can also be read as him, referring to the prophet, in which case it means they recognize his prophet. Also, if you read the German commentary on the Quran by Rudy Parrott, which they very resource when commenting on sixth dialogue with Christians and greater familiarity of Islam is not needs safer and easier to say that this verse is talking about recognizing Muhammad, which 7157 very clearly states can be done. I've also indicated how I think this fits broader Quranic teaching about how the people of the book should recognize Quranic geography as well. But then in 146, it talks about it in the third person. Those who gave scripture know it. If it was talking about recognizing Muhammad, we might recognize those to whom we gave the scripture, Yahrifunaka, they recognize you. Sorry, just trying to understand the next point that I've made. And finally, yes. The Quran towards it, those who are given the scripture know with certainty that this is the truth from their Lord. The reason I title this slide as well, it doesn't matter, is both because I think 144 teaches the same thing, that the people of the book are supposed to recognize Quranic geography, although admittedly admittedly with less clarity. There's another point as well, which is, well, let us assume that in both 2146 and 620, it is talking about recognizing Muhammad. Well, in the context, what is the basis for doing so? The entirety of the context has been about the direction of prayer. And so presumably, if this interjection is made that they recognize Muhammad, it is on the basis of what has been taught, which is the direction of prayer towards the holy site. Presumably, it is because what Muhammad brings matches up what their own scripture teaches on this issue that they are able to recognize that Muhammad is a prophet. Another option, which I don't have time to go into in this presentation, is that they recognize it. Those to whom we've given the book recognize it. It could actually refer back to the book, to scripture, to revelation. I don't myself go for that, although it is very plausible. But again, the argument would actually be the same. How are they able to recognize the book? Because of the harmony of what is being taught in the surrounding verses. So that's most of my presentation. We're much more quickly going to look at 620, where much of the groundwork has already been laid. And here again, we have a choice. Is it talking about the people of the book recognizing the truth of monotheism, or recognizing the prophet? So I've already shown you the verse in its immediate context. And so you'll note in both the verse before and the verse after, and actually in the first kind of 20 verses in this chapter, the truth of monotheism and the futility of idolatry is the overriding theme. So in verse 19, it says, do you really bear witness that there are other gods beside God? I myself do not bear witness to any such thing. Say, he is only one God, and I disown whatever you join with him. And then in verse 21 again, it says, who does greater wrong than someone who fabricates a lie against God? So the broader context of this early part of Surah 6 is about the truth of monotheism, as I mentioned. But to be fair, it does also talk about Muhammad as a prophet. And so once again, this text can be read either way. Now, the Muslim interpretation, the early Muslim commentaries, compared to 2146, they are much more leaning towards the interpretation that Muhammad is in view. So very early on in Maqatil, he thinks that who refers to the characteristics, the sifa of Muhammad in their books. In At-Tabari, he says that they recognize that he is one God, not a group of gods, and that Muhammad is the prophet who has been sent. So he thinks both monotheism and Muhammad are in view here. Fakhruddin Razi, he discusses different, in 2146, he discusses many different options, whereas in 620, he seems quite confident that the prophethood of Muhammad is in view. Interestingly, Abd al-Halim does translate it, they know this, not know him. So he is perhaps on the other side. And then Hilali Khan, like with At-Tabari, in fact, they say they're quoting, they're influenced by At-Tabari here. He thinks both is in view. Recognize him, that is Muhammad, and they also know that there is no God but Allah, and Islam is Allah's religion. So why do I think that it's talking about they know it instead of they know him? Well, once again, you can make a grammatical argument. The prophet is addressed in verse 17 in the second person, Yamsaska. So we might expect those whom we've given the scripture know you, but it's not. Again, it's in the third person. They know it or they know him. And also later on in Surah 6, we find a somewhat analogous phrase. Shall I seek any judge other than God when it is he who sent down for you the scripture clearly explained? Those to whom we've given the scripture know that this is, or yahlamuna annahu, revealed by your Lord with the truth. So it here is clearly something revealed. We are clearly talking about the revelation of the book and not recognizing the prophet. So that's my section on they recognize him or it as clearly as they recognize their own sons. That's about the clarity with which the people of the book are supposed to be able to recognize someone or something. And very briefly, I will talk about Surah 74, 30 to 31, which doesn't have this phrase, but in my interpretation, it is suggesting the specificity with which the Quran and the Bible overlap on a certain topic. So I remind you of the verse. There are 19 in charge of it, that is hellfire, none other than angels. Those who've been given the scripture will be certain, and those who believe will have their faith increased. Neither those who've been given the scripture nor the believers will have any doubts. I can't go into it in great detail now, but my interpretation of this, when set against the broader backdrop of what the Quran says about the Bible and how the Quran expects the people of the book to recognize the Quranic teaching in light of their scripture, I interpret this verse accordingly. That it's saying that the fact that there are 19 angels over hell is something that the people of the book will recognize because it is in the Torah and in the Gospel. And much to my relief, that was confirmed by some of the Muslim interpretation as well. So the Study Quran notes that most have understood this passage to find 19 angels in the previous scriptures, and that includes Al-Baghawi, Ibn Kathir, Al-Qurtubi, At-Tabari. Muqatil on this verse says that the believers of the people of the Torah might know that that which Muhammad said is the truth, because the number of guardians of hell in the Torah is 19. And then At-Tabari, and I wasn't sure here if this was his own opinion or Mujahid's, the shift wasn't clear to me. He said that opinion is that the people of the Torah and Gospel might be certain of the truth of what is in their books, of the matter of the number of guards of hell, as it agrees with that which God revealed in his book to Muhammad. And then he gives a few opinions that say thus. So what might the Quran be referring to here? If the Quran is saying that 19 angels can be found in the previous scriptures, what's going on there? It left me scratching my head. Gabriel Reynolds also says this is a slightly puzzling passage. There are a few different theories out there. I think Gabriel Reynolds is the most plausible of the theories out there. He appeals to 1 Enoch 6, where in some manuscripts, so it's a commentary on Genesis 6 about the sons of God coming down and taking the daughters of men, whatever that might refer to. Yes, in 1 Enoch 6, in some manuscripts, there are 19 angels who are listed as heading up the 300 angels who come down. I think there are flaws with this theory. This depends upon certain manuscripts, not others. It depends upon the leaders of the angels, not all of the angels. They also do different things. Those angels are consigned to hell, not appointed as gods over it. So I have problems with that theory, though I think it's the best one out there. My theory is actually that I wonder if this is simply part of the poetry of the Quran. It's very, when you read the passage in Arabic, so it ends, it says, over it, that is hellfire, are 19 in Arabic being Tisata Ashar, 19. And the rhyme scheme of verses 18 to 37, so before and after this passage, end in the AR rhyme scheme. And so this fits very nicely. Now, this would be true with other teams as well, not just 19. But otherwise, one has to say it's coincidental that this matches the rhyme scheme instead of being chosen specifically for that purpose. I was recently, in my post-student days, I had the luxury to read books at my own pace. I finally managed to get through Noel Dacre's famous History of the Quran, and I came across this passage where he notes other occasions in which numbers seem to be chosen for the sake of rhyme. So in Surah 55, it talks about two gardens. Normally the Quran talks about Jannah, the garden paradise, but there it talks about two gardens being mentioned. They're in two fountains of running water. They're in fruit. They're in of every fruit two, and two gardens. And Noel Dacre suggests, and I think it's right, that the jewels are being used here, the jewel number, to support the rhyme scheme. Noel Dacre gives another helpful and very similar example in Surah 69, verse 17, where 8, in the context, angels shall carry above them the throne of thy Lord. This, he says, would be puzzling if Thamania did not fit the rhyme scheme. And I'm pretty much on time. I'm about to finish. I won't go into these in detail, but I do briefly list in my thesis other examples where I think we can find that the Quran expects the people of the book to see it overlapping and agreeing with the former scriptures on matters of some detail. So in 9:111 it says, God has purchased the persons and possessions of the believers in return for the garden. They fight in God's way, they kill and are killed. This is a true promise given by him in the Torah, the Gospel, and in the Quran. Why mention that if it's not still in the Torah and the Gospel with them? In 4:829 again, we see it talks about the believers bowing, prostrating, seeking bounty from God and contentment. Their mark upon their faces is from the effect of prostration. That is their likeness in the Torah. So in the Torah, it's saying you find this physical description of the believers. And then their likeness in the gospel is a sapling that puts forth its shoot and strengthens it. It grows stout and rises firmly upon its stalk, impressing the sowers, that through them he may enrage the disbelievers. So again, quite specific descriptions of the true believers in both the Torah and in the gospel. And then in 17:101, it's actually made very clear that, if you're not sure about this, you can go ask the people of the book. It says, in the past, we gave Moses 9 clear signs. Ask the children of Israel about it, about these 9 signs in Egypt. So to conclude, thank you so much for your patience. And I know that we've kind of covered a lot quite quickly, but I hope this has whetted your appetite and you might like to know more. So I'd be very happy to send people my thesis if they're interested. That's my email address. You can pop me an email. So to summarize in a nutshell, I hope that my thesis contributes to the discussion about how does the Quran relate to the Bible, not just specific verses where the Quran says things about, confirming it or its guidance and light, but how does the Quran actually relate with those former scriptures? And the verses that I've looked at, in my interpretation, stress the clarity and the specificity with which they are supposed to agree. I also wonder whether, and this is above my pay grade, but could Surah 2146 and my interpretation of it, could that shed some light on the geographical milieu of the Quran? If it is suggesting that Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael, these stories are linked to the founding of the sacred site in the Islamic holy city, and then if the Torah lists those places as being further north, could that be another piece of evidence in the northern milieu hypothesis? That's it. Thank you so much for listening.